The 2000 U.S. presidential election was an important one for many reasons. For one, it was the first election of the 21st century and of the new millennium. It was also the first election after Bill Clinton was term limited since he had served 2 terms in office. It also became famous for controversy around the number of votes in the state of Florida, which ended up deciding the presidency. But there have been several videos made about the Florida recounts and the subsequent Supreme Court case. I am here to talk about this election from a different angle. This election is one of the closest elections in American history, with Bush winning the election by 271 electoral votes to Gore's 267. Bush won the election by one more electoral vote necessary to win the election, which is 270, and he won 271. As a result, there were many disputes due to the election being so close. But when you think about it, it really shouldn't have been that close. Bill Clinton was a very popular president, and the economy was booming. Gore should have beaten Bush fairly easily, but instead it became a close fight that Gore ends up slightly losing. But before we get to that, we need some context. The campaign started the year before in 1999. As Clinton was term limited, both parties went through the primary process to pick their respective nominees. For the Democrats, it was clear that Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, would be the nominee. But that didn't stop New Jersey governor and former NBA player Bill Bradley from challenging him. Bradley was Gore's only real challenger for the nomination, and he contested him in the primaries. Bradley campaigned as a more left-wing alternative to Al Gore. On January 24th, the Iowa caucuses came around, which Gore easily won with 62.85% of the vote. On February 1st, the first primary in New Hampshire began. This race was a bit closer, but Gore still won with 49.73% of the vote compared to Bradley's 45.59%. There were two more primaries in February in Washington and Delaware, both of which Gore won pretty easily. Then on March 7th, Super Tuesday began, when there would be 16 contests on the same day. Gore won all of these contests fairly decisively, and as a result, Bradley would suspend his campaign 2 days later. This meant that Al Gore was basically the presumptive nominee. Due to Bradley suspending his campaign, that meant the rest of the primaries were a walkover for Gore, which made him the first candidate that wasn't an incumbent president to sweep all of the nominating primaries and caucuses. For the Republicans, it was a bit more difficult to get a nomination, as they didn't have an incumbent president or vice president. The Republicans had about a dozen candidates, but most of them dropped out before the primaries. There were 6 candidates still in the race going into the primaries, though. There was Texas Governor George W. Bush, who was the son of former President George H.W. Bush, Arizona Senator John McCain, former Assistant Secretary of State Alan Keyes, publisher of Forbes magazine Steve Forbes, former Undersecretary for Education Gary Bauer, and Utah Senator Orrin Hatch. Bush was considered a frontrunner at the start, but the others were determined to challenge him. Senator McCain was considered a candidate that could really challenge Bush for the nomination. The Iowa caucus came around on January 24th, and Bush won with 40.99% of the vote, compared to Forbes in second, who got 30.5% of the vote. This was a big victory for Bush, but it wasn't a sign of victory just yet, as Bush's own father had won the Iowa caucus in 1980 and lost the nomination to Ronald Reagan. Utah Senator Orrin Hatch dropped out of the race on the 27th after finishing last in the caucus. Next was the New Hampshire primary on February 1st, which John McCain won pretty easily with 48.53% of the vote, while Bush got 30.36% of the vote. This was probably due to McCain putting more resources into New Hampshire than he did into any of the other primaries. A week later came the Delaware primary, which Bush won with 50.73% of the vote, and took its 12 delegates. 2 days later, Steve Forbes would drop out of the race, and then 6 days after that, Gary Bauer would drop out of the race. The race was now between Bush and McCain, and, also Alan Keyes, but mainly Bush and McCain. On the 19th came the important South Carolina primary, one of the primaries that McCain had mainly put resources into, along with New Hampshire, of course. This primary was famous for its negative campaigning. There were anonymous push phone calls throughout the state that criticized McCain's personal life and patriotism, including some rumors that McCain's adopted daughter from Bangladesh was actually his illegitimate child. 4 days before the primary, there was a debate between the candidates that were still in the race. This debate was famous for McCain confronting Bush about the ads that were made about him.
Finish up, okay? So
Then he'll finish up. Okay.
so here's what happened. We ran an ad that was a response ad. At a town hall meeting, a mother stood up. She said, Senator McCain, my son was 13 last year. We had a lot of trouble of explaining things to him that went on in Washington. She said, now he's 14. He's told me not long ago, John McCain is my hero. He's the man I want to be like. Well, last night he came into her room, she said, and he had tears in his eyes because he answered the phone. And the phone call, even though he told the caller that he was 14, said, do you know that John McCain is a liar and a thief and a cheat? Well, that night I called my people together. I said, take down our response ad. We're running nothing but a positive campaign from now on. I committed to that. I promised that.
Now,
George,
are you saying
I hope
that
you will
George...
take yours off the air.
Please go ahead. Are you saying that Governor Bush was responsible for that call?
I don't know who was responsible for it, but I know that the attacks go on.
Let me just say one thing. Let me say one thing about all this business, John.
I told you, I pulled them all down.
You didn't pull this ad.
Yes, I did.
This that ended up in the man's windshield yesterday? That questions my... This is an attack piece.
That is not by my campaign.
Well, it says paid for by John McCain.
That is not by my campaign. That is not by my campaign.
Well, then somebody's putting stuff out. I agree with you.
But you're putting out stuff that is unbelievable, George, and it's got to stop. And your ads have got to stop.
Are you going to... Well, let me put it... I can end this now. Are you going to pull anything?
I'm going to stand by what I'm putting on TV. And what I put on TV was looking in that camera and saying, you can disagree with me on issues, John, but do not question my trustworthiness, and do not compare me to Bill Clinton.
This was a big win for Bush, since it was the first major primary he managed to win after losing to McCain in New Hampshire. Bush's win was credited to him receiving endorsements from Governor Jim Hodges and Senator Strom Thurmond, and religious right figures, which was a big help in a state with a large evangelical community. There were two more primaries on the 22nd in Arizona and Michigan. McCain would go on to win both of them. Arizona was expected since it was his home state, but Michigan was actually a big victory for McCain. The next big primary would be in Virginia on the 29th. There were also Washington and North Dakota that day, but in terms of delegates, Virginia definitely had more, so it was of course the most important. Bush would win the Virginia primary with 52.79% of the vote, taking its 56 delegates. This was a big win for Bush, especially going into Super Tuesday. The next set of primaries would be Super Tuesday on Tuesday, March the 7th. Bush would win 9 of the 13 contests on Super Tuesday, including the California primary, the New York primary, the Ohio primary, and the Georgia primary. McCain only won the New England primaries. These results were a huge blow to McCain's campaign, and he suspended his campaign 2 days later. With McCain dropping out, Bush was the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party. Technically, Alan Keyes was still in the race, but he had nowhere near the delegates that Bush had. Keyes would officially withdraw on July 25th. But Bush basically became the presumptive nominee for the Republicans way before that, and Bush would be facing Gore in the general election. Both candidates became the presumptive nominee in March, despite Bush actually facing stiffer competition. Now that both candidates were nominated, it was time to choose their running mates, which is who would be vice president if either of them won. Bush ended up picking Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense under his father when he was president. Cheney was originally put in charge of Bush's committee to select a running mate, but Bush ended up picking Cheney himself. Gore ended up picking Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman as his running mate in August. Bush would be formally nominated at the Republican National Convention on the final day of the convention on August 3rd, as well as Cheney as vice president. Gore would be formally nominated at the Democratic National Convention later that month on the 17th, as well as Lieberman as the vice presidential nominee. After the conventions, Bush and Gore were deadlocked in the polls. It was now time for them to campaign for the general election. The campaign was mostly about domestic issues, such as how each candidate would use the budget surplus, reform Medicare, and Social Security, healthcare, and each of their tax plans. But foreign policy was still a prominent subject. Bush criticized Clinton's involvement in Somalia and the Balkans, as well as a lack of military spending. Bush also pledged to reach across the aisle and work with Democrats, emphasizing him doing so as governor of Texas. while Gore questioned Bush's fitness for the presidency, saying he lacked the necessary experience to be president, and pointing to gaffes Bush made in speeches and interviews. Although President Clinton was very popular in 2000, the Monica Lewinsky scandal still cast a shadow on the election. Bush and the Republicans strongly denounced these scandals and promised to bring honor and dignity to the White House. Gore decided to completely avoid the scandals, even opting to distance himself from Clinton and not have Clinton campaign for him, which would later come back to bite him in the ass. When talking about the 2000 election, it is also important to mention Green Party candidate Ralph Nader, who is a lawyer and an environmental activist. His campaign was known for his big super rallies in huge arenas, such as Madison Square Garden. He wasn't as popular as Ross Perot was in the previous two elections, but he was still considered a threat to Al Gore as he was running to Gore's left and could possibly take votes from Gore in a close election. With how close the polls were, it was not something Gore needed. A huge part of any U.S. presidential election campaign is the presidential debates. Debates had happened during every election cycle continuously since 1976. In 2000, there were 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. At first, there were disagreements about where the debates should be held. Bush wanted 1 debate to be held by the Committee on Presidential Debates and 2 on other TV networks, while Gore wanted all of them to be held by the Committee on Presidential Debates. Eventually, both agreed that the debates would be held by the Committee on Presidential Debates. The first of the 3 debates was on the campus of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and it would be moderated by the host of PBS NewsHour, Jim Lehrer. Some key events during the debate included Gore using the term lockbox. Gore in the debate mentioned the term lockbox 7 times when talking about Medicare and Social Security. This was mentioned a lot when SNL did a parody of the debate.
We'll put Medicare and Social Security in a lockbox and protect them. I'd be interested if he would this evening say that he would put Medicare in a lockbox. Under that, Jim, under my plan, I will put Medicare in an ironclad lockbox and prevent the money from being used for anything other than Medicare. I will keep Social Security in a lockbox, and that pays down the national debt and the interest savings.
The debate also included Bush using the phrase fuzzy math in response to Gore using numbers to attack Bush's tax plan.
Governor, 1 minute.
Man's practicing fuzzy math again. There's differences. Under Vice President Gore's plan, he's going to grow the federal government in the largest increase since Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965. And we're talking about a massive government, folks. We're talking about adding to or increasing 200 new programs.
The debate was also known for Gore sighing a lot, which you saw in that clip I just showed there, which made him come off as arrogant and dismissive. The reaction to the first debate was fairly even, with 42% of the post-debate poll saying that Gore won, and 39% saying that Bush won, and the rest saying it was a tie. 2 days later was the vice presidential debates, which took place in Centre College in Danville, Kentucky. It was hosted by Bernard Shaw of CNN. According to the ABC poll, Cheney was judged to have won the debate, with 43% saying Cheney won, only 24% saying that Lieberman won, and 27% calling it a tie. The next presidential debate was in Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, hosted again by Jim Lehrer. This debate was notable for Gore saying multiple times that he agreed with Bush. Bush was judged to have won this debate fairly easily, according to an ABC poll, with 46% of voters saying Bush won, 30% saying Gore won, and 18% saying it was a tie. The third presidential debate took place in Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. This debate was once again moderated by Jim Lehrer, but this time it was a town hall style questioning, meaning questions were asked to the candidates by audience members who were voters. This debate was notable for Gore being very aggressive towards Bush and even invading his personal space.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
This was considered a defining moment of this debate, and Gore was criticized for his aggressiveness during this debate. The polls were pretty even after the debate, with 41% saying Bush won, 41% saying Gore won, and the rest saying it was a tie. These debates were considered a massive missed opportunity for Gore, as he was expected to easily win these debates with his superior knowledge of policy. but the two of the debates were considered a tie, or at least Gore slightly won, but didn't easily win, and the second debate was considered a loss for Gore. As Election Day was drawing near, there was a story that could have changed the course of the election. It was revealed just 4 days before the election that in 1976, Bush had been arrested for drunk driving. This was considered big news since not only was Bush arrested, but he kept it from the public. Bush responded by acknowledging the charge and saying that he hadn't drank alcohol since 1986. Gore decided not to comment on the matter as he felt it would be inappropriate. The election came on Tuesday, November 7th, and the results were inconclusive, to say the least. The election was projected to be close, and close it was. Eventually, the election came down to the state of Florida. Whoever would win Florida would become president. A couple times during the night, Florida was given to Gore, and sometimes it was given to Bush. It was never really conclusive, since Florida was by far the closest state in the election. Eventually, Florida was the only state not called, and at that point, Gore had 267 electoral votes, and Bush had 246. So whomever won Florida's 25 electoral votes would win the presidency. I'm sure anyone who studied elections knows the story from here. Gore was originally about to concede, but he retracts his concession, and recounts go on for over a month. Eventually, on December 13th, the Supreme Court voted to stop the recounts, effectively giving Bush the presidency. Bush therefore won the election with 271 electoral votes to Gore's 267, or I guess 266, since one DC elector decided to cast a blank ballot for some reason, but it wouldn't have mattered anyways. Bush got one more electoral vote than required to win the presidency. Gore actually won the popular vote with 48.4% of the vote to Bush's 47.9%, but Gore didn't win the necessary states to win the Electoral College, which is what matters. Now, a lot of people, when talking about this election, will talk about the ensuing recounts, the hanging chads, all the court cases, etc., etc., and that's an important part of this election, but it's all been told before. Everyone has talked about that. And I want to approach this video from a different angle. A lot of people say Bush robbed Gore or that Gore ran a good campaign, he just fell slightly short. But really, Gore should have easily won this race. Bill Clinton was a very popular president during this election, and Gore was his vice president. Now, I will say it is very difficult for a party to win more than 2 terms in a row, and, Gore was essentially running for a 3rd term for the Democrats. But if a president is popular enough, their party will win a 3rd term, such as Bush in 1988 when he was Reagan's vice president. Reagan was very popular, and Bush won in a landslide. Gore failed to take advantage of Clinton's popularity, and he turned a very comfortable race into a race he ends up losing. A couple factors could have led to Gore's defeat. The first being the fact that he distanced himself from Clinton during the campaign. Gore distanced himself from then-President Bill Clinton due to the Lewinsky scandal, fearing that it would damage his campaign, even though Clinton's popularity actually increased after the scandal and the ensuing impeachment. If he had tied himself more to Clinton, he might have won a few more states, and not only won the election, but won it by a decent amount. He lost a lot of states that Clinton had won in the last 2 elections, including Clinton's home state of Arkansas and his home state of Tennessee, and also some of the other southern states like Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. He could have probably won at least like a couple of those states had he tied himself more to Clinton. Another reason that's given behind Gore's loss is his vice presidential pick, Senator Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman was seen as boring, and he was also one of the first Democratic senators that denounced Bill Clinton's affairs. Gore picked Lieberman as a way of distancing himself from Clinton. Normally, vice presidential picks don't really matter, and they don't have as much of an influence on campaigns, but considering this election was so close, it might have swayed a couple voters, and, it could have definitely swayed the election. There was also third-party candidate Ralph Nader, who was given as one of the reasons why Gore lost. Nader was a candidate that was running to the left of Gore, so it's said that a lot of voters who would have normally voted for Gore ended up voting for Nader since he was more to the left. States like Florida and New Hampshire, who went to Bush in razor-thin margins, both had Nader getting more votes than the difference between Gore and Bush in those states. Of course, there's no way to prove that Nader voters would have supported Gore, but it's more likely that they would have supported Gore since they were voting for Nader as a more left-wing option. And the final reason given for why Gore lost is Gore himself. As mentioned before, Gore distanced himself from President Clinton, thinking that Clinton's scandals would hurt him during the campaign. But Clinton actually had a very high approval rating, and campaigning with Clinton could have made a difference in key states. There was also Gore's performance in the debates. Gore didn't have terrible performances in the debates by any means, but he was expected to do far better as he was seen as more knowledgeable on policy than Bush was. In the first debate, he annoyed a lot of people with his constant sighing whenever Bush spoke, which made him come off as arrogant. In the second debate, he spent most of it just agreeing with Bush, and most people said he lost that one. In the third debate, he was far too aggressive getting into Bush's personal space. If Gore had stronger debate performances, he could have made up the small differences that cost him the election. Gore also tried to run a populist campaign, which would make sense if he was running when a Republican administration was in power, but a Democratic administration was in power. Not just that, but he was the vice president. There was no reason to be running that style of campaign while trying to show yourself as a continuation of a successful administration. There was also the fact that his home state of Tennessee felt abandoned by him and like he didn't represent their values, and as a result, they didn't vote for him, which would have, if he had won Tennessee, would have gotten him enough electoral votes to win the election. He also managed to lose Clinton's home state of Arkansas, which would have also given him the presidency had he won that as well. Gore's biggest flaw, though, was probably his charisma. Gore seemed like a generic politician that didn't really excite anyone in the campaign. That, plus his personality in the debates, made him seem like he was arrogant. Gore just couldn't connect with the people like Clinton or even Bush could, and as a result, he wasn't able to get the votes to win the election. All in all, in my opinion, Gore's defeat comes down to Gore just being a weak candidate. He distanced himself from Clinton, who was a popular president. He underperformed in the debates. He tried to run a populist campaign as a part of the incumbent party. He alienated his home state, which cost him the election. And he didn't have any charisma and came off as a boring politician. That is why he lost. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like videos like these, please like, share, and subscribe, and comment on what other elections you would like to see me do. And I will see you guys later. Take care.